Please welcome Smil.
Good evening. Thank you to Holocaust Memorial Day Trust and everyone else that was involved in organising this and giving me an opportunity to speak. As mentioned already, it's the 30th anniversary of the genocide in Bosnia. It was incredibly well documented. However, what happened in Bosnia is often reduced or simplified to the town of Srebrenica in July of 1995, where more than 8,372 Bosniak Muslim, predominantly men and boys, but also hundreds of women as well, were murdered in just a few days. However, what happened in Srebrenica was just a culmination of atrocities that happened across Bosnia starting as early as 1992. In total, more than 100,000 people were killed. 2 million people were displaced or became refugees, and some of them settled here in Scotland, and some of them are in the audience here as well. Up to 60,000 young girls and women were raped. At the end of the war, there was 35,000 missing persons in Bosnia. Now, 30 years later, there's still more than 7,000 missing persons in Bosnia, including members of my family. It's great that there's a commitment from the First Minister to fund Holocaust education, which I think is incredibly important. And we do some great work in Newcastle. And I hope also that there's a commitment to include the Bosnian genocide in that work as well somehow, because I know there's people doing incredible work here in Scotland as well. So I haven't figured out how to include and condense everything that happened to my family into 10 minutes. But I want to reflect on this year's theme for a better future through one defining moment of the war when I, as an 8-year-old boy, lost faith in humanity. In that moment, I don't think I believed that there was any humanity or any good left in this world. And I often think back to this moment and how different my life could have been had my mom decided to deal with this day differently. So some of you might have heard about the South African Truth and Reconciliation Commission from the 1990s. People came together to share their stories. People that had been the victims of apartheid stood up and said, this is what happened to us. And for the first time ever, it felt like the entire world was listening to them. People got to find out the truth about what had happened to them, to their relatives and loved ones. Bosnia has never had a Truth and Reconciliation Commission, and vast majority of the perpetrators of war crimes are still living freely in the same communities that they once terrorized. And most people will never get a chance to see justice or to stand up in a courtroom to say what had happened to them. So for the past 10 years, I've had my own Truth Commission, and I've been sharing my story up and down the country in schools and colleges and churches and mosques and synagogues and communities. And I believe that when we really listen to another person's story, it becomes part of our story in the sense that we take it into ourselves and it informs the way we relate to the world. So today, I am asking all of you present to listen to my story and Alfred's story that we heard earlier and to make it part of your own story as well. So war in Bosnia came abruptly for us kids. It felt like overnight. In reality, there was a steady rise of the dehumanization of Bosniak Muslims going back for years before the war. 6 months after we moved into our new home that my parents had been working on for years, that designed and built, in the spring of '92, our village was surrounded initially by the Yugoslav National Army. So the army that was designed, that was there to protect us. In reality, it was an army that was already under the control of Serbian nationalist Slobodan Milosevic, which again some of you might have heard of. In the first 9 months of war, we moved 14 times. Each time we moved, we didn't know where we were going or what we would find, but we simply had to move to survive. We eventually settled on the outskirts of my hometown with my uncle. Life was incredibly difficult, but we tried our hardest to preserve normality and friendships, our values, our childhood. But war starts polluting every part of your life. And quickly, the games that we would play before the war were replaced by games of war, by guns and tanks and shooting. And all the things that we took for granted, water, food, electricity, was gone overnight. Then, a year into the war, in the summer of 1993, things got even worse for my family, when the Croatian forces this time started rounding up all Bosniak Muslim men into concentration camps in my hometown, including my dad, most of my other male relatives. Some of my cousins were just 16 years old. There was camps for women and children, but we were one of the lucky families allowed to remain in our home and then eventually expelled to Bosnian government-controlled territory. After weeks of wandering around, exhausted and starving, often sleeping in ruins, escaping and stepping over dead bodies at times, we made our way to a town called Mostar and to my Auntie Emina's house. And Mostar is a town in the Herzegovina region famous for an old Ottoman bridge. I'd suggest Googling it if you haven't heard of it. Really beautiful little town. I remember the night when we arrived at her door. We were exhausted, we were frightened and starving, but I felt an instant relief being there. She was always my favourite auntie. She was always joking around. She had this huge, big, wavy hair that I was always fascinated by, and she always had a smile on her face and just this amazing confidence about her. Nearly all of my memories of her are of her smiling even during the most difficult moments of the war. Life was incredibly difficult in Mostar. There was more than 60,000 people in the eastern part of the besieged city of Mostar. And if you want to understand what life was like in Mostar, there's a wonderful documentary that can still be found on YouTube called Unfinished Business by BBC reporter Jeremy Bowen. Mostar was surrounded on one side by the Bosnian Serb forces and on the other side by the Bosnian Croat forces. 100,000 shells fell onto Mostar. More than 80% of the city centre were destroyed. If bombs and bullets don't kill you, then disease and starvation will. In November of 1993, the old bridge in Mostar was destroyed, and there are two recordings of the destruction of the old bridge in Mostar. One was by a Bosnian man who was actually killed during the war, and the second one was actually by a Scottish chap called Jimmy James, who's a very good friend of mine, and he's got a huge archive. He spent the war period in Mostar, and he's got hours and hours of war footage. He has just returned to Scotland, actually, after living in London for many years. Some days we would eat once, we fell asleep hungry every night, but my mum and my Auntie Emina were so creative. They used chicken feed to make bread. They used grass to make pies. The chicken feed made this awful brown bread. I still can't eat brown bread now, 30 years later, but it kept us going. They risked their lives to ensure we were able to eat, to stay warm and have water to drink. And although we were living in such awful, awful conditions, my Auntie Emina just gave us this sense of normality and safety. So in the middle of the siege, again, desperately trying to hold on to our value, our humanity, on the things that we so valued in life, we started school, and really as an act of defiance, desperately, as I said, trying to hold on to the things that my parents always valued. And we loved school because it was a brief moment of normality, a moment for us to leave the house, to be children, to be around children. My last night of school was actually on the 24th of January 1994, and that night, the Croatian forces used a plane to drop bombs onto Mostar. Through my classroom window, I could see our whole street up in flames. As you can imagine, a classroom full of 8-year-olds. There was so much panic and screaming, candles flying around everywhere, but I was frozen in shock. I don't remember crying or screaming, and this was unlike me because I was a crier. I cried at every opportunity during the war. I just kept looking up at the house because I knew everyone that I loved and that I knew was still alive was back up at the house. My Auntie Emina was wounded. She had been standing at the front door, hearing the plane. She thought it could have been an American plane dropping food pallets, so she went out to check. The blast threw her back into the house. My grandparents, my auntie's 2 kids, my sister, they put her on a blanket. They carried her out of the house. Neighbours rushed out to help. They got her into a car, but petrol was almost impossible to find because of the siege as well as the international sanctions, so they just pushed. They managed to get her to the main road into another car. They drove frantically in the dark with bombs falling around them. But that car runs out of petrol as well, and they just had to push and push and push. She lost so much blood, but they couldn't give her anything to stop the bleeding, to ease the pain. This was a makeshift hospital. It didn't have any medical equipment or medicine. One of the doctors that was actually leading the team trying to save her was my mom's cousin, and she was so strong, and she hung on for hours, and they tried to do everything. And I often think how much she suffered in those moments. And sadly, at 4 a.m. the next morning on the 25th of January, her heart stopped beating. Even though we had experienced awful things by that point of the war, I had seen and stepped over dead bodies. I saw my mom being searched and grabbed by soldiers. On one occasion alone, our house was hit by 6 tank shells. And I can't even explain what that fear felt like. I witnessed my dad and my uncles and cousins taken to concentration camp, but this moment was different because nothing prepares you for the pain of losing a loved one. This is a photograph of my Auntie Emina. And when she was killed, it felt helpless. It felt like a part of each of us was gone. No one ever thought something would happen to her because of how strong and how fearless she was. And all of our hope was gone in an instant. And my Auntie Emina was amazing because she helped us to get through the war because she could see the future. Not in the sense of a fortune teller who sees the future as it will be. She had a clear vision of the future as it should be, and there's a distinction there for me. She knew what her values were, what kind of world she wanted to live in after the war. She knew she wanted her children to be educated, to be safe, not to be consumed with hatred and anger. And as I mentioned at the start, I was 8 years old at the time, and in that moment, I lost faith in humanity. And if I'm being honest, I was full of hate and I was full of anger. I didn't believe that there was any good left in this world, and I just kept thinking, how could there be when we were being hunted and slaughtered and killed in this way, and the rest of the world was watching? In moments of emotional distress, your mind will latch onto any construct that will make it feel better. We were in shock. The winter of 1994 was brutal. It was bitterly cold. We were starving. Life felt fragile and meaningless, as if any of us could be next. And if I'm being honest, a small part of me wasn't even afraid of being next. My biggest fear was being left behind. We were hurting. We all wanted to feel better. And in that desperation, we were vulnerable and susceptible to hatred, to anger, to extremism, and to false beliefs. The easiest and the most soothing and emotionally satisfying thing for my mom to do in that moment. She's just lost her sister. Her kids are starving. She hasn't seen her husband, her brother, and most other male relatives for months. Would have been to tell us to direct all of our anger, all of our pain towards all creation people, towards all Catholics and Christians even, to tell us that they're all the same and all equally responsible, to tell us that they're all murderers and rapists and liars. She could have protected her pain with a shield of anger and aggression. And I think that's what most people would have done in that situation. But my mom did something different. She realized what impact this would have on us. So she sat me, my brother and sister down on the very day that her sister was killed. And she carefully explained that we can't live our lives consumed by hate. She told us that there are good and bad people in this world. She said we're all individuals, and the best way to resist those that were trying to kill us was not to become hateful like them. And for me, this remains one of the most amazing examples of someone choosing compassion over hatred. And of course, it wasn't just one conversation, and it wasn't just for my mom. My grandparents did the same, and my dad did the same, and this was only the beginning. But we all have the power to choose how we react to any situation in life. That's the one thing no one can take away from us. And for me, that's the biggest lesson from Bosnia, because it wasn't just my mum and my grandparents that reacted like this. So many people in Bosnia rejected hatred in this way. What I have learned through my own Truth Commission is that peace is personal. It is only through making peace with what happened to Emina that I can begin to make peace in the world more broadly. Our lives could have been very different had my mum decided to deal with her sister's murder differently. And I think about my Auntie Emina and my mum and how they lived their life, actively striving for peace, not being weighed down by anger and hatred. They've taught me that peace is more than the absence of war. It is created through hard work and strong actions. It is all the actions taken to prevent war and violence and racism, discrimination, prejudice, and all forms of othering. They've taught me that remembering is important to paying respect to the past, but only by taking action can we build a better future for us all. And that is the true nature of peace, and that is why I do this work. As the Holocaust and the Bosnian genocide move further into history, those of us who are still alive inherit the stories of those who are not. It is our job not just to remember those who were killed, but to use their story to make us better people, to make it a part of our own story. So what I'm asking all of you today is to take the stories that you have heard and use them to inspire you to work towards peace, to bring people together, and to make them an integral part of the story that will one day be told about you. Doing this work can feel meaningless at times and frustrating, particularly at the moment. It seems there's so much violence in the world. Populist parties winning elections across the globe. We saw riots in parts of the UK in July. I think most people are aware of war and acts of violence, but what is peace? What is an act of peace, and how can we take acts of peace in our everyday lives? Thank you so much for listening.